Like many people who read the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Dr. Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette, it left an immediate imprint on me. It was as if I had put on sunglasses, like from the movie They Live. Only what I saw through them was explanations for the behavior I saw in men and the man in the mirror. The concepts of the archetypes, and that they are an energy source deep within us that we can access to become better men, was my initial reading of this work. But a few years later, I came across a recorded lecture by Robert Moore. In it, he spoke of the dangers of these energies, and the message came across a lot more powerfully than it did in the book. This recorded lecture, titled Archetypal Images of the King and Warrior, resonated with me much more deeply, especially the dangerous aspects of these archetypes, with Moore claiming that if we don't regulate this power within us, it will kill us. It's a warning for all men, and I share this lecture with you here, with the audio levels cleaned and tuned up. Enjoy.
I'm Robert Moore, and I will be lecturing this week and next week on a topic that I lecture widely over the country on, which is 4 archetypes of the masculine. And I want to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about what I propose to do tonight and next week. First of all, I have a number of assumptions. While I am a professor of psychology and religion, and while I do have a research interest in ancient forms of personality and culture, studying archetypes of the masculine and historical forms is it's interesting, but it's not interesting enough for me to spend as much time thinking about it as I do just in itself. That is to say that the topic I'm talking about tonight has got enormous contemporary relevance for contemporary men and women, and so it's not merely an academic research interest, though certainly there are a lot of people that have spent a lot of time studying these patterns. In phenomenology, they talk about these as structures of human experience. That's just a way of saying archetype without admitting it. So in other words, one of the things I just want to say is we study, in this context, archetypes of the masculine or anything else in relationship to their transformative significance, that is, their significance for contemporary life, and understanding what goes wrong in this case in the lives of men, and why, and to get some ideas about how that might be changed for the better. So the one thing I'd like to say just a little bit about before we get into the 2 archetypes I'm going to talk about tonight, which are the king and the warrior archetypes, is I want to elaborate just a second, just a few minutes anyway, on this idea of the relationships between the archetypes and transformation. And this is going to go real fast, and you have to study sacred space and transformation, that sort of thing, to get this in a lot more detail. I have tapes here that I've given on space and transformation, which would elaborate this. But the structure of transformation in human personality is threefold. There is what is known as the preliminal space, that is the time prior to a major transition or change. You might say this is before you admit that you're going to be getting a divorce, or before you admit to yourself that either you're going to shoot yourself, or you're going to get into therapy, or you're going to become a hopeless alcoholic, one of the 3. It's before you get the nature and extent and enormity of one's personal crisis clearly in mind. That is massive denial, right? Massive denial. And this should be familiar to all of us since we do so much of it, so much of the time, all of us. And our culture majors in it. If I had any one phrase to characterize American culture, it is manic defense. Manic defense. And it's not just American culture, of course, although other world cultures typically do not do as much, do not spend as much energy denying the reality and presence of evil as we do. They don't have attitudes toward it that I approve of very much, but certainly if you walk the streets of Bombay or Bangkok, as I have recently, you will see that they don't bother to deny it too much, or to cover it up too much, or to repress it too much. But in this stage, it's massive denial, and this is the stage Jungian would talk about as persona. You're still locked in persona. If you flirt with transformation and you realize what it's going to cost you, either financially or emotionally, then you try to have what Jung called a regressive restoration of the persona, which means you try to make out like nothing is different. You try to make out like you don't know what it is that you know, because if you admitted that you know what you know, then you would be forced into something that's like, please, Mr. Custer, I don't want to go. But anyway, so that's the first stage. And many people manage to live and die pretty much in that. But this is the stage at which the archetypal always comes on like gangbusters. This is threshold 1, and this is threshold 2. This is threshold you have to go over to get into extraordinary space. This is a threshold you have to go over to get out of it, or as out of it as human beings ever get. But when you realize that something is very wrong with your life as it's functioning, then there will be constellated in your psyche a unconscious or conscious, one of the two, quest for a sacred space and some sort of ritual elder who will help you undergo some form of initiation. So in my work on this topic, there are three archetypal motifs that are always together in a process of transformation that works. That is, if it works, these things are together. If there are a lot of cases in which it doesn't work, but there is a magus or ritual elder, better known as a magician or healer. There is a sacred space which is carefully bounded, where the power of the archetypes can be related to without getting destroyed. And there is an understanding of the archetype's initiation, which is what one is going through in that process of change. In the context that we're talking about tonight, we're talking about masculine initiation. We could just as well talk about feminine initiation. And we're going to be talking about different aspects, initiating different aspects of the masculine. Tonight, the initiation of the king, in a sense, and the initiation of the warrior. But anyway, what I'm trying to tell you is that this is an archetypal process always going on in the psyche, either badly or effectively, or some combination of the two, usually. And so hopefully this is where you encounter I used to encountering the sacred. In this context, we will say the archetypal patterns, which are loaded with power for regeneration. That's what they're for regeneration. They're also loaded with power that can make you crazy. And that's not what they're for, but that's what happens to a lot of people. Anyway, they are clearly numinous. Clearly numinous, that is to say, loaded with a sense of power. And Jung said that transformation always occurs through the numinous. You may get band-aids some other way, but real transformation and healing comes through an encounter with the numinous. And we'll have an occasion to talk about that more in a little bit. Anyway, so hopefully the process goes like this. You realize your need for a change. You find a guide in sacred space and undergo whatever ritual humiliation you're needing to undergo in this initiatory process, and you deal with whatever task it is that you've been avoiding, and then you, regenerated and empowered, leave this and go on, bringing back the boon, as Joseph Campbell says, to your world, to the realm, in some sense. And so that is that's the shape of transformative space. In this context of this class tonight, in terms of the masculine, if you're accessing masculine archetypes well, and your masculine initiation was heavily and thoroughly consolidated, then you may not need to get into this with regard to masculine archetypes. But if you're like 99% of us, you probably need some regenerative contact with the archetypal masculine. That is, both females and males need this, because we're usually so terribly wounded in the masculine, all of us.
And if you mention humiliation, do you get getting?
Well, initiation as a structure almost always involves an experience of humiliation. Now, the part of us that is so easily feels humiliated is usually the infantile grandiosity. And so often in the course of getting initiated, we feel humiliated a lot of the time when, if we really had had our initiation carried out thoroughly at an earlier time, or our parenting, if the parenting we had received in early childhood had been sufficient, we would not be nearly so humiliated. There's a litmus test. The more humiliated you feel, the more of the time, the crazier you are in terms of narcissistic pathology. And it's not your fault. That is, the more sensitive and easily hurt we are, the less decent parenting we got. And the more susceptible to humiliation we are. The feelings of humiliation. And therefore, any kind of individuation process that we go into, trying to realize our potential as men and women, will be experienced as humiliated. And what's really getting humiliated and relativized is the grandiosity. But it's very important that we understand that the chances are that everybody you see during every day has got a problem with grandiosity. And it is a ubiquitous problem in human life. And we can talk about that more later in terms of the way. See, here's a rule you can go by with men. Men get into trouble on the shadow sides of these archetypes when they have not had the experiences which can help them transform their infantile grandiosity. And they will tend to act out in grandiose ways out of these masculine archetypes, one or more, to the extent that they've been really wounded as children. To the extent that they've had real solid nurture, it will be much easier for a man to mature and consolidate his masculinity and to be a man who can access these archetypes in a positive way. So that gets the assumptions I'm operating out very, very, very clearly. That is, these four archetypes I'm talking about, king, warrior, magician, and lover, are psychological structures in the psyche. They are amoral. They are numinous in their power. If and one can access them like any archetypal structure, either constructively or destructively, or a combination of both, which is where we live. So we're going to be talking about the light side, what I would call the constructive expression of that archetype, and the shadow expression of it. And so what I propose to do now, if it's all right with you, is to launch into a discussion of these archetypes, their purpose, and something about their structure, and I'm just going to lecture a while, if it's all right with you. And feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand if I'm unclear about something, and I'll try to respond at that point. We'll take a break about, what time have you been taking a break? About 8? We'll take a 10-minute break about 8, yes.
Could you just clear up what you mean by infantile grandiosity?
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of work on narcissism, literature on narcissism. The people who've done the most work on this are very clear that narcissistic pathology manifests itself in a very primitive structure in the psyche, which Freudians call the grandiose self-organization. That means there's an actual entity in the psyche which is split off from the consciousness of the person usually, but which is sort of a little Lord Fauntleroy. Feels entitled, doesn't feel it has to do anything, deserves rewards and adoration, and hates criticism, very sensitive and easily hurt, blah, blah, blah. And you can look in the DSM-3 or the DSM-3R under the narcissistic personality disorder category, and it gives a clinical description of it. Basically, it just means a very childish sense of one's own importance and powers, one that really does not correspond to reality, but which dominates one's self-appraisal, either in a positive sense or negative sense. Now, let me just make one thing clear, and we'll talk about it. Narcissistic personality disorder is a person who has a very destructive relationship with his king archetype. Excuse me? With this king archetype I want to talk about in a minute. A narcissist really has a sort of a shadow appropriation of the king archetype. They really think they're a king. Unconsciously, they really act like they think they're a king. And internally, they really do think they're a king. They are in effect possessed by the archetype. There are two ways that these archetypes typically affect you destructively. One, they can possess you, and the other, it can oppress you. If you're a person that thinks you're God's gift to the world, it's probably the grandiose self probably has possessed you. If you think you're just a piece of shit, your grandiose self-organization is oppressing you. It isn't that you are without a grandiose self-organization. It just means it's split off from your ego consciousness and attacks you all the time. It attacks the ego consciousness all the time. So if you're extremely self-critical and find yourself undervaluing yourself a lot of the time, you're under attack by this structure in the psyche that is just outside of just out of the room a little bit, but you can tell its presence by the way you're feeling. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but yeah. Well, it certainly is, but that's where you get a manic depressive, you get a bipolar or cyclothymic kind of cycling, or a bipolar disorder. Manic depression is nothing other than someone who wobbles back and forth from a over-identification with the archetypal self in Jungian terms to a sense of being alienated from it and attacked by it. So we can talk more later about depression in that context. If a person is depressed a lot, in my view, the old way of talking about that used to be that a manic presentation where one is really high and flying high and everything is a defense against one's depression. You've heard of the manic defense against depression. I mentioned it earlier. I tend to think that most of the time it's just the opposite dynamic involved, that depression is a defense against grandiosity. And that the more depressed you are, the more hidden grandiosity you've got. And the quicker you find the hidden grandiosity and puncture it, the quicker the depression will lift. And I think if you'll explore that, you'll find that a fruitful place to dig. But let me get into these specific archetypes now, and then we will discuss them. I think I'd like to just sort of outline them both before our break, and that way you can get a chance to compare them a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about the archetype of the king. Best place to study this sort of thing, of course, is in the literature on sacred kingship, sacral kingship, which has been a topic of study for a long, long time in history of religions and anthropology. The first thing to realize is that there's no such thing as a king who is not a sacred king. There's no such thing as secular kingship. That is, the whole idea of king is a religious category. The best thing I've seen from a psychological point of view on this was the book by John Weir Perry, which I think is now out of print, but I'm hoping they're going to bring it back out. It's a little paperback entitled Lord of the Four Quarters, Myths of the Royal Father. And Perry published this little book in which he brought together a lot of the myths about the sacred king, and then wrote an introduction to it, which I think is the finest thing I've ever seen psychologically on this. And Perry points out several different functions that the sacred king played. In my work on this topic, I've just basically continued where Perry left off. But he says several things. First of all, the king is the source of fertility. For the realm. That is, kingship is a phenomenon of archaic conceptions of fertility. If the king is what the king ought to be, then everything will flourish. See the relationship between the king and creativity? It's right there in those of you who are Christians. It's right there in Christian iconography and symbolism. Christ the King is at the center of the world. You see many of these churches where there's a crown up there on the cross. And it is through the sacrifice of the person of the king that the world is nourished. Nourished in the Christian iconography through some of the symbols show wine coming down from the foot of the cross. Grapes. So the cross is sort of a wine press. And the world is sort of renewed through the blood. But that's just one representation of this ancient attitude toward kings. And there was an ancient practice whereby we've heard the thing queen for a day. Well, that is an acting out of a very ancient practice, except they don't carry it as far. That is a reflection of the ancient practice of killing the king. In the earliest times, we think that the kings were slaughtered after a certain period of reign to ensure the continued fertility of the world. And the whole concept of sacrifice is related to kingship in this archaic worldview. The important thing, king is okay, world is okay. creativity flows. Something wrong with the king, something wrong with the realm. The legends about the Fisher King, the Grail Kings, the kings that are wounded kings, kings that are wounded in the groin, as you see in the Parsifal stories, there is a flaw at the heart of being when there's something wrong with the king. We'll see a little bit more about how you can understand that in a little bit. What else? Well, fertility, but right order. You've all heard that little story about the rainmaker. You know, the rainmaker, there's not been any rain, the rainmaker goes into the hut, puts himself in the dial, or whatever the system is, puts himself right with the forces of the universe, and then it rains. Well, that story is a kind of a deteriorated form of the story about the king, because it is really the king who, if he is right, nature is right. You get many different images of this in different cultures. You get the concept of Dharma. You get the concept of the Tao. You get the concept of Rata. In various cultures, different ideas about this. You get the similar thing in Judaism, that the king was supposed to have been, in Israel, an upholder of a transcendent law of God. But in any case, right order, and it's not based on coercion. It's not supposed to be based on coercion. It's supposed to be an inner thing, that this order grows out of the inside of things, that if it's not imposed from without, if the king is right, it is an order which issues from within things. The third thing that I have added, because I've worked a lot more with some of the ways this stuff works, is the role of the king in blessing, which, as you can see, related to the first, but it's not simply that. You can watch this structure operating in contemporary life in terms of papal audiences at St. Peter's, and the fascination with wanting to view the royal family when they're out in travels. Another place you see it, if you didn't know this archetype, you wouldn't recognize it. You wouldn't recognize it as such, is you see it in the Indian gurus in ashrams, in the practice of what's known as darshan, which is viewing the guru and being viewed by the guru, who sits up on an elevated platform. Well, that's just the archetype of the king and the throne. There is something in human beings that wants to be seen by this thing. Those of you who studied some psychology probably are reminded of Erickson's idea of confirmation, that a young adult needs an experience of confirmation before their identity will be consolidated. But this is what I just call blessing. The king has the eye of blessing. And, of course, can give it or withhold it. And one of the things that you want to think about when you're thinking about your own masculinity, your own masculine side, is your experience with the kings in your life, or the king in your life, and whether you got the eye of blessing or its corollary, which is the curse. And if you study the history of religion, particularly the Hebrew scriptures, you constantly get this imagery about who got the blessing and who got the curse. It's right up front. Blessing is a real thing in the Hebrew Scriptures. Well, it's a real thing in most human scriptures because it is a real thing in the human psyche. And if you are a mature adult, you got blessed. If you've had trouble getting yourself together, you didn't get blessed. It's that simple. And it takes some mediation of this archetypal structure to get blessed. And we can talk a little bit later about the way this affects people and families. But it's quite clear that that if a man is accessing the positive side of this archetypal pattern, he will probably be a pretty creative person himself. Yes.
Do you see these things as separable or inseparable?
Well, in the pattern, in the archetype, they're not separable. In actual expressions in life, that's arguable. But archetypes are patterns which, it's like that thing about the magician, initiation, and sacred space being together. With a king, you get this concern for creativity, and I'll just say creativity there too. Creativity, order, and blessing. And if a man, the word generative comes to mind here. If a man is in touch with this part of himself in a constructive way, and a good enough way, as Winnicott might say, then he will not be feeling stagnated or despairing of his age, feeling over the hill at 45 or whatever. He won't be like the millions of retired who feel that their life is over at 65. In fact, a man who's really in touch with this, in many ways, finds his vocation most strongly at 55 and can continue it as long as he can keep his health. But anyway, he will not be, he will not, if he's accessing this in a good enough way, he won't be consumed with anxiety. Another thing he won't be is a workaholic. See? And we'll get to workaholics when I talk about the warrior archetype. You get workaholism when you get a warrior archetype, which gives you lots of energy and attack modes without any balance and any centering. And so if it moves, you work more. You just work harder. It's your solution to everything. Just work harder. But in any case, and another, the real thing, if you work in organizations, if a man is adequately related to this, he will be a pretty good mentor. He will not be threatened by other people getting insight, power, capability. He will be capable of being invested in empowering other people. He won't be so preoccupied with his own impotence that he can't support the empowerment of other people, both men and women. Feminists are fond of saying that the shadow expression of this is patriarchy, and that this person is out to disempower women. Well, they're partially right. This person is out to disempower women. But what many feminists don't realize is he's out to disempower men too. He's playing king of the mountain. He doesn't want anybody getting any independent center of initiative. He wants to be adored. He wants to be, as we put it in the technical literature, mirrored. He doesn't want to mirror you. He wants to be nurtured. He doesn't want to nurture you. If he's a graduate school professor, he wants graduate students who mirror and nurture him in his work. He does not want to nurture them in their work. And you see many other expressions of it. But this capacity to empower is right here, and this capacity to bless. And there you get the issue of power, which is key in all these masculine archetypes. I think in many ways it's a key concept in relating to any expression of the archetypal in human life. As we'll see next week, it's very tempting to use knowledge and insight simply for personal aggrandizement. And certainly archetypal power and energy is simply one thing that you can exploit and use, and humans are real good at that. But the thing that I go around trying to get people to realize is that this image of the king is not something I would like for men to lose access to. If they lose access to it, then they're cutting off an enormous amount of their own sense of potential. And it's because we have such a little experience of the positive side of this in real men that we become so cynical and sometimes even nihilistic about masculinity and begin to equate masculinity with patriarchy, which is very common in intellectual realms today, to equate masculinity and patriarchy. In my view, the two are not to be equated at all. At all. Patriarchy is a shadow expression, in my view, of the masculine, and is really a very infantile expression, masculinity.
Yes. So would you say is the king archetype the one that's capable of providing the nurturing in the face of the...
Yes. Yes. And if a man is able to access this, the sort of the true king, the light king aspect of this, he doesn't, you see this in the Senex Puer split. If you've got a mature man, the arrogance of a young man does not make him want to kill him. See, so much. I mean, there's some humor in the more mature man when he runs on the arrogance of a puer. And the more mature man is much more likely to feel affection for the young man, even in the midst of his arrogance. He's much more likely to, a more mature man is much more likely to look at a really sharp young puer, arrogant puer, and say, wow, what this guy could be, with some help. I've got to, the response would be more like, I've got to keep him from getting himself killed. I've got to help him not self-destruct. Because if there's anybody that's in the positive side of this, he's run into a lot of the negative side of it. He knows there are a lot of Sauls around. There are a lot of Herods around who, when they run into a really sharp young man or a woman, really want to kill them, literally. The hate and envy in the shadow expression of this is enormous. So let me talk a little bit about the Shadow King before I go on to the Warrior. We'll elaborate all this in our discussion. So the shadow side of this thing is really manifest in a real feeling of impotence and a related feeling of paranoia. The man who's really alienated from this thing and can't access it in the right way, yet is experiencing it. I'm really serious. Look at Saul in the Bible stories, and look at Herod, and look at Caligula, and just study some historical manifestations of kingship. There is a sense on the part of the Shadow King that chaos is breathing down his neck. It's just about to get him. And everywhere he looks, he sees conspiracy. And of course, if he's been brutal and sadistic enough, he's managed to generate a lot of palace coups, would-be palace coups, because he richly deserves being deposed. But he's totally incapable of blessing, and really wants to be blessed, feels the need to be blessed, and will do everything he can to locate anybody who has the talent to be a threat, and try to do away with them in whatever means he can. You see this a lot in gratuitous humiliation of subordinates in front of other people. It's one of the things you can look for. Anytime you're ever present when a superior is highly critical of a subordinate, you're seeing the shadow side of this thing in operation. It was an Oriental principle, always help people save face. And the positive expression of this in a personality will make an individual who's in a leadership position very aware of the necessity for helping people save face, and will minimize humiliation of subordinates. In fact, on the contrary, will take every opportunity to lift the achievement of the subordinate to the attention of others in the organization. There are a lot of expressions of this, but the reality of the cursing is the central theme in the shadow expression of this. It's always, the misuse of these archetypes, all four of them, is always a power trip. Power as opposed to eros, or love. The shadow expression of all of them comes out in what the Jungians call the power shadow. You've undoubtedly heard about that before.
It would be a modern day archetype.
I think there are many. Stalin is the one that's clearest, most documented. There are histories full of examples of it, though. But Richard Nixon's paranoid side, his paranoid side was coming out of this. The thing that people project upon Ronald Reagan, unless they're liberal intellectuals, is the positive king aspects. I say they're projected on Ronald Reagan. I don't say that he embodies that. But the enormous power that man's got politically in terms of appeal to wide ranges of people that don't even agree with him on things is that Ronald Reagan, that he is able to elicit projection of the positive side of this king archetype. Remember, somebody once asked me, well, you always talk about the king and all these others. Why don't you ever talk about the archetype of the father? Well, this is the archetype of the father. Remember, if something is not numinous, it's not an archetype. See? And an ordinary father is not numinous. See? When a lot of the struggle that we have, and this is just an important point to make, see, part of our developmental struggle is getting over our quest for the archetypal mother and father. Because the only time you can really access that in normal development is between 1 and 4, when when your actual parents can really carry the archetypal parents. After your cognitive function gets better, they can't be the archetypal parents for you. And the real problem of the human predicament is that by the time you reach adulthood, nobody can finally adequately carry the archetypal for you because you're too smart. You're not stupid. You can see that XYZ is not an archetype. This is what gets into the transference in therapy relationships. You see that your analyst or your therapist is not an archetype. And depending on what resources the school of thought or the person has to help you deal with that horrible realization, whether or not one gets healed. Happily, in Jungian thought, we don't believe that the only way you can get to these archetypes is through the analyst. We believe you're wired for these archetypes and that you can connect with them internally and that you need not simply have them mediated by somebody, some human in the outside world. Let me talk a little bit about the warrior, and I'll probably need to elaborate it more after I break. It's very difficult in contemporary culture, unless you're teaching at the War College, to talk about the positive side of the warrior archetype. That's not something people want to hear about. But here, as in many other places, when you're dealing with a psychological potential, as Jung would point out, you're not talking about something that's good or bad, you're talking about something that's there. It's obviously got some sort of purpose. You either use it for what it's for, or you misuse it, or you get used by it. The warrior is the same thing. And although I have many friends and associates that are very big in the peace movement and who really are irritated with me about talking about this, I hold very strongly to the fact that this is a ubiquitous phenomenon in every psyche, and including the peacenik, and it has a number of very positive traits that come out of it, positive potentials that come out of it. What are some of them? You tell me. What are some of the positive things that come from the warrior aspect in the psyche? It's related to achievement. What is required for achievement, you might say. The things that are required for achievement. And courage would be one of them. What else? Exactly. Persistence, and I would add to that an important thing for the warrior, stamina, which is another way of saying a similar thing. Stamina, that is, that when you're really exhausted, that's when you redouble your efforts. You don't focus so much on your comfort state. You know, Adlerian psychologists are fond of talking about comfort types. People that get tired if they even envision some task. You know, sit down like, well, I better have another drink before I think about that anymore. But it's the capacity to persevere in the face of pain, and this is very key. And to think about ordeals, task ordeals. It's the capacity to focus on a task which may require that you not be comfortable, or that your experience not be pleasant. Anybody, for example, that's working on any creative project needs a lot of this archetypal potential. If you're working on a book manuscript, if you're working on building some new institution or some new institutional expression that is really requiring focus, without this thing, you will not have much active focus. The capacity to be proactive and not just passive in the face of situations. I was just reading today that they've begun to link inability to get angry, express anger, and attack with cancer, the onset of cancer. And it's no accident that somebody like Simon and these other people get people to imagine their immunological system attacking cancer cells. But it's an interesting reflection to think about the inability to recognize an enemy that's truly an enemy. That's what's going on in AIDS. It's what goes on in cancer. It's what goes on in a number of kinds of illnesses. But you would argue that at the archetypal level, if this archetype is not being accessed adequately, you cannot recognize an enemy when it really exists. And you certainly cannot mobilize your forces. You certainly cannot get focused. And you certainly cannot stand the pain which is required to attend to the task, regardless of whether or not the ants are biting you. And so there are many others, and you could elaborate these and can elaborate them. But it's my sense that very few worthwhile things get done without a lot of accessing of this particular psychological potential. You will never have a great artist that doesn't have a lot of it. And you could argue that that would be true in a lot of different creative professional roles. In fact, the shadow side of the warrior is something that you see present in very creative people. That is to say, it's very difficult for a warrior to value relationships, intimate relationships, very highly. Intimate, committed, marital type relationships. This is not an archetype that is much into the female archetype of Hera. This particular archetypal structure leaves the wife at home. He would defend the wife and the kids to the death out there somewhere on the boundaries of the empire. And he would have the most beautiful camp followers attend to his personal needs. I think of the movie An Officer and a Gentleman, and if you know the subcultures around the Marine Corps, always faithful. This is my rifle and this is my gun. This is for fighting and this is for fun. Well, there is a certain attitude towards sexuality and women in the part of the warrior archetype. The Greeks had a saying that Mars and Aphrodite had an affair. That's exactly correct archetypally. The man who is in a lot of Mars energy may be married, but his energies will not be going into building a home. It will be building some creative product. And the kind of woman that will really elicit his eros will be what Tony Wolfe called the hetara, the companion, the woman who can mirror him and see how great he is as an artist or intellectual or soldier or whatever. And there may be great sex, but little marriage. And this kind of thing. So the shadow side of this thing is that if you don't have a lot of eros, if you're not accessing the archetype of the lover enough, which we'll get to next week, you can really get into being a warrior without much concern for humans. What I call the Shiva principle. You can get into the firepower side of this and into the joy of destruction. Now, this is something that exists in human life that most people do not like to look at. They need to look at it because it's there. this part of the psyche that, when it's constellated, just loves killing. It's the part that, when you get wounded enough and you regress enough, get your pump 12 gauge and say, I'm going to go down to the local McDonald's and I'm going to kill me some humans. I'm going to kill me some humans. And I'm going to kill as many, as fast, as thoroughly as I can. And I'm going to enjoy the hell out of it. It's a very widespread phenomenon, and in your lifetime is likely to grow. Because of collapse of structures that inhibit this sort of thing. Cultural structures, cultural values, the television culture, drugs, drug flood, and all sorts of other. We're turning out borderline personalities in droves. Our school system exists for the purpose of turning out borderline personalities.
Bring out more what?
Borderline personalities. The school system exists, obviously, if you just look at what it does, to generate and support gangs and borderline personalities. And it's part of our denial system, our massive denial system, that we do not realize how serious this is. This is enormously serious business. And it's one interesting thing that this warrior archetype is so unconscious in our culture now, particularly among the leadership, so-called leadership, that you don't get practically any leadership that is interested in focusing the seriousness of our situation culturally, much less trying to do anything about it. I mean, I'm always amused at people that think that the most adequate thing you do about the drug trade is build more drug rehabilitation centers. You know, it's amazing. Yeah.
A number of years ago, John Gruner was a science fiction writer, wrote a book called Stanley Zanzibar. It was really interesting because he would take one social phenomenon and then just project it. And what he did on this one was the population that made Zanzibar very people. And what he had in there growing was people going amok.
Running amok.
And when I read that book, it was in the 60s. And I knew of a couple instances, like the sniper attack.
Yeah, right.
But more and more and more. I mean, it really is kind of frightening because you see it. And what it seems to be is just like all the cultural, and it always happens in big cities. Sure.
Well, it started happening in rural areas now. Over Christmas, there was this man in a rural area, southern state, that got his guns and killed his entire family when they came home for Christmas. Killed all of them. It is this thing, you see, you understand something. I get to keep this clear because it's important to get a sense of what archetypes are. I mean, archetypal psychology is real practical and real scary. Because what you're seeing is an increasing manifestation of the gods and goddesses in the absence of egos and ego structures and self-structures, as the Freudians call it. The less ego strength and self-structures you have, the more you're going to see of infantile grandiosity. That's what a god is. It's infantile grandiosity. And the Greeks knew it. The Greeks said, you don't want to act like gods and goddesses, because they are, they're messes. You want to be like them. Today, we tend to be a little romantic about the archetypes, Wow, I want to have an archetypal experience. Well, that's misunderstanding it. It's not pretty. And you don't want to be an archetype, and you don't want to be possessed for one, and you don't want them running around loose. And what we've got now is increasing number of archetypes running around loose. And Mars is god of war, and he gets loose and runs around. They got a lot of firepower now. I mean, with the firepower that you can get now on the black market, you can do a lot of damage in a short period of time. And it's very interesting, if you know anything at all about the drug situation, you know that the police are completely outgunned, totally, overwhelmingly outgunned. They've got their little pea shooters up against Israeli Uzis, and at least Uzis. And most police, if you talk to any that know anything about this, you're very careful not to make arrest, unless the drug people know you're going to arrest them. In which case, you've already got a prearrangement, because you don't want to get killed. So this thing is going to be an increasing thing, and the whole pop cultural scene, the rock scene, is a manifestation of the gods and the goddesses, and the manic acting out that's involved in a lot of the culture that you and I may like, drug, sex, and rock and roll, is archetypal. And it manifests most clearly and in the most raw form where there aren't any ego structures. And so increasingly what we're going to have is more bizarre expressions of this. And it's not a very pretty sight. But anyway, shadow side of the warrior. Very hard on relationships. See the movie The Great Santini. The Great Santini. A guy possessed with this thing. And it can lead to Lieutenant Calley or the Nazi SS. The Death's Head SS was a cult of this archetype. A cult of German war gods. And the whole ethos, the whole ethics and ethos of the Death's Head SS was a religious phenomenon. You could trace the line right back to the Aryan war god Indra, storm god Indra. Direct line right back, and predict the values, the attitudes, the behaviors, the cold steel attitude that all human feeling is weakness. Because when you're in this archetype, you do not feel except a sadistic pleasure, a erotic pleasure at hurting. Now, lest you think this is just expressed in bizarre ways, many couples in their marital fights get into this. You can tell when this is getting constellated, when the fight you're having just went past that point where you know there is going to be any communication at all. And where you know that you or your spouse or both are beginning to simply seek to hurt, which is most of the time in marital squabbles, and this thing gets constellated, and the thing about it is it dissolves relationships. Once this thing is constellated and starts firing, the only thing any human can do is engage in damage control, because it will dissolve structures and relationships when it's firing. Yes.
How does this relate to the concept I've been learning more about? If you're about Buddhist concepts of a peaceful warrior,
Yes.
A warrior who's a pacifist.
I think it's very deeply related to that. They call Shambhala warriors, some of them. A lot of the peace people the peace people I respect are very aware of this archetype. And know that you have to be a warrior if you're going to be serious about peace. And most martial arts traditions have this built into it. And the most advanced senseis in all the martial arts traditions are very peaceful souls. They know that if they have to act out, use the violence of their tradition, that they're trained, that their spirituality has failed. And so, for example, if you study Japanese kendo, which is the way of the sword, which is the whole ethic of the samurai, the ethic of the kendo sensei is one which, if somebody's foolish enough to come up to you and pick a fight, the true kendo specialist would never fight with them, if at all possible. Many teaching stories about that I don't have time to tell, but it's related to what you're talking about. But you see, what I'm saying is built into this archetype. That is to say, that would also be true of a really mature man who was a Soviet general. And it would also be true of a mature man who was an American admiral. And this is what a lot of people don't realize, that it is not whether somebody proclaimed himself a pacifist or not. It is the relationship to this structure and what level one is relating to it, how one relates to it. But anyway, let's take a break for about 10 minutes, no more. It's one of the good things about Jungian thought is this whole concept of the archetypal self as distinct from the ego, or as distinct from the self with a little s. What I've been doing really is to elaborate the way in which the archetypal self manifests. A lot of people talk about this archetypal self like it's just sort of expressed in the Christ archetype or something, you know. That's really a radical oversimplification. The archetype of the self carries these four patterns in both masculine and feminine forms. And one of the important things to do is to realize that inflation, which is a Jungian idea of grandiosity or hubris, can express itself in any of these patterns. That all of these patterns are seen in the archetypal self. That is to say, if you look at the lore around Jesus, just take Jesus for example. Jesus is presented as king. Jesus is presented as the warrior. Jesus is presented as the magician. And Jesus is presented as the lover. And to the extent that something is a representation of the fullness of the self, it will carry all these things. Just like any living king who was really a very mature man would carry all of these things. Any mature man would embody all of these archetypal structures in himself. But that doesn't help you differentiate the way in which the self itself is very multiplex. And we don't see people who manifest the archetype of the self very, fully. We see people who manifest aspects of it. And the chances are, if one is possessed or inflated, you're not manifesting all of them at once, probably. You're probably manifesting one side of it. For example, as we talked about earlier, the workaholic is very inflated. I mean, they may not feel inflated, but they're very inflated. They think they can do everything. Or they feel like they ought to be able to do everything. You hear people say, I just feel like it just needs to be... of course, I never say anything like this. But there just ought to be 24 more hours in a day. The only thing I need is 24 more hours. Well, there's the inflation of the workaholic. It's going to change time. See, in order to be truly myself, I would have to be able to change the nature and flow of time. See, there's nothing great about that, right? Yes. And that is to say, anytime you get anybody, here's the rule, anytime you get anybody with a compulsive aspect of behavior, it's always inflation. Always infantile grandiosity. Always archetypal contamination. Always. Period. Archetypal contamination. But the key is to understanding this, and here again I've worked more on the comparative phenomenology of this, the expressions of the self than what I have done. I mean, so I don't talk about the self expressing itself. It's different aspects of it to me. So you get the person that is really inflated through the king archetype, narcissistic personality disorder. Just imagine the narcissistic personality disorder on his throne, waiting to be adored. really expects you to adore him. And worship is not necessary, but it helps. But a lot of the time, the narcissistic personality disorder is not into doing. I mean, sometimes they are, but not all the time. A lot of the time, they want you to do for them. And be their gopher. If you are, as we'll see later, if you're inflated in the archetype of the lover, you will be promiscuous, and you'll be into compulsive sexuality. Well, compulsive sexuality is inflation, but which has taken the form of the inflation of the lover aspect of the self. And this is true in both females and males. Anytime you see promiscuity, you've got enormous inflation. It is the god or goddess that just can't get enough. It's like the woman that's got so much Aphrodite possessing her, she says, so many men, so little time. And the masculine version of that. The Chicago singles scene. But it's always an archetypal inflation. And so when you speak of the archetype of the self, it contains all these. But if you look at any specific human being, you will notice that they manifest the different aspects of it in different ways, except for people who are enormously competent in some ways and have managed to be able to be inflated on all of them at once. You think, for example, here of John Kennedy, who was possessed with this thing. And his power and his demise both are clearly related to the way in which he was enormously inflated by the possession of this structure. Well, certainly evidence is that he was inflated in that way. But he was inflated in all these other ways too. He obviously didn't think he needed advisors at certain levels, because his advisors told him not to be in Dallas without that bubble top on that car. One of the things that you get into when you get in this inflation, this grandiosity, is that you're not going to die. They can't kill me. Feeling of invulnerability. And clearly he had that. The whole fantasy of Camelot was very key, very important, very archetypal, and people may have made jokes about it, but it was very much the psychological organization under which Kennedy and his people operated. But it was also true in a number of the leaders of that time. I mean, anytime you get someone who begins to put himself forth as the great redeemer, the great leader, there's a real enormous temptation on this. The same thing happened to Gary Hart. Gary Hart was just snapped up with this thing, and there's no way to make any sense out of Hart's behavior and his blindness than to see it as a possession by this thing. I mean, he really felt entitled to be president, and he really did not think that it was possible that anybody had the right to criticize his behavior. And this is typical of this structure. When you're in this, nobody has the right to criticize you, because you are that from which the principles of order emerge. All right? Well, yes, it is the archetypal self is, of course, in the psyche, the archetypal structure out of which concepts of order grow. But when the ego identifies with it, then I am saying, I am the source of order. I am the law. Or as the French king said, I am the state. Or the Pope, when he's in his most inflated place, he feels like he is the church. I am the church, you know. And so the archetype of the self contains all of these things in such a powerful combination it's hard for us to even begin to imagine. It's hard for us to even begin to imagine the luminosity and the numinosity of the self. It is not domesticated, no matter how much we talk about it. It is enormously powerful. And when you get close to someone who is mainlining it, they will have an effect on you. That's what Max Weber's whole sociology of the charismatic leader is about. If you encounter a charismatic leader, even if you totally disagree with him and you wouldn't give him a dime, blah, 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 but you're in their presence and they're really a charismatic leader, you will be changed by being in their presence. And it's because they elicit your projection of the archetype of self. It's the only way to explain why people do stupid, inhuman things in response to certain people's leadership. Why they get automatically blind and can't think when they're with certain individuals, charismatic individuals. This is the explanation of charismatic leadership. So anyway, you get a little sense for these two particular structures. You see, they're very important for any man. Let's just stay with it. Any man who's going to be a leader, because if you don't have this king business, then you're not going to have much a sense of concern for the realm. Ownership, you might even say, of the realms. Yes, the word, I think, stewardship is the one that I have found most useful in talking about the positive side of this. The stewardship of the realm is the best way to talk about the virtue of the positive side of the king archetype. And if you don't have the warrior, then you don't have the energy, you don't have the focus, you don't have the capacity to discern where the issues are, who the enemy is, and what you need to do about it. And you will not mobilize, you will tend to not think you need help. Thing about the difference, this is one of the things people get confused about. They think that the warrior archetype and the hero archetype are the same thing, but they're not. Hero is really more of an archetype of the adolescent. The warrior knows that he can't do it alone. It has to be a team kind of effort. Yes.
That was exactly what I was going to question. One of the things was think about the requires the warrior in order to his relationship to other warriors.
Yep. Because if you're not into making alliances with other warriors, then you're really a grandstander, and you're really a puer into your own glory. Because, and the other side of this is, if you, it's like that little movie, The Dragon Slayer. It's only the uninitiated puer who thinks he's equal to dealing with the dragon by himself. Simply doesn't understand how big the problem is. And once you understand how big the problem is, then you start trying to find your other knights of the round table. Because you know that even if you've got the best there is, that it's still by no means a foregone conclusion what the outcome is going to be. I think particularly of the movie The Magnificent Seven. That is about knighthood, the knight archetype, archetypal warrior. And what was the name of the Japanese version of that? The Seven Samurai. So that's a very important point. And the movie Top Gun deals with the attempt to change a hero into a warrior.
Now, for the warrior, is the ultimate end of the task or the goal that important, or is it less important than the doing, or is it as important, or is it?
Oh, it's very important. It has his total loyalty. See, the whole concept of duty and honor and loyalty and sacrifice comes out of that.
Right, but does it come out of doing that so they, for what they get in return?
To the extent that one is really embodying the positive side of this, it is not self-serving. It certainly gives one a sense of meaning. And so it's the sense that you get meaning, that this is meaningful. It's like Viktor Frankl's logotherapy. To the extent that you experience meaning, that's certainly giving you something. But the capacity to be a warrior turns on whether or not you can care enough for something that is totally unrelated to your personal egoistic interest. That you can will the trans-egoic goal. And it's the kind of thing that in our culture we make fun of. You know, the very idea about somebody sacrificing for a trans-egoic goal is considered something that's really foolish now. Nobody in their right mind would do it, you know. And it is precisely that kind of thing that is the most critical thing about our cultural situation. It's very difficult to get people upset about anything now. There is practically nothing that will get people disturbed enough that they would want to sacrifice anything to make a change in it.
Does the end justify the means for, let's say, the positive expression of the warrior?
I think that that's where the shadow area, the gray areas come. That's always the issue you get discussing in this whole thing. And of course, then you get into all of the whole ethics of war, so-called just war theory, and all that sort of thing. I don't think that for the positive side of the warrior, a person that's trying to use this constructively, there's always a limit on the exercise of power. You would never see an arbitrary use of power in anybody that was accessing the positive side of the warrior in a mature way. But willingness to use it in the service of the end is certainly also the case. Hence, you get a realism about power. You know the theologian H. Reinhold Niebuhr. You've ever heard of him? He would be someone that would be talking about the kinds of issues that there would be, the ethical issues related there. What do you do when confronted with a Hitler? Do you emulate Chamberlain and hope Hitler is going to be nice? Or do you confront it up front on the bridge of the nose? See?
Now, another cliche comes to my mind, and that is, that's not whether you win or lose, but it's how you play the game.
That's sports. Sports is a deterioration of the warrior aspect. We have sports rather than warrior. We have athletes rather than warriors. And the idea of the game, see, is an idea that this is not serious. And it's very interesting how in our time we change everything into sports. You know, it's all the Super Bowl. everything is the same. The media does it. You have such a socialization of us to respond as if we're responding to a sports event on TV. And so you get starvation, and it's like a sports event on TV. And you get the enormity of the social ills, and it's another event on TV. The media have this amazing capacity to hypnotize people into this. But everything is turned into sports. Very few things are serious in this world. That is for most people.
So the warrior plays to win.
The warrior,
He's in it.
the warrior doesn't intend to lose. There is a thing about the warrior, and you see it a lot in Western movies, and there's a lot of this lore, this warrior lore in Western movies. If you watch it, if you look very closely and you're looking for the archetype, you can see it. Because the archetype is evident in a number of places. One where it says to the young gunslinger, the old gunslinger says to the young gunslinger, don't pull that thing unless you mean to kill somebody. Now that's warrior talk. That is, that's a very, your power is a serious thing. And unless it's not something to play with, if you are going to wear a gun, you must be prepared to use it should the right situation emerge. And this is at the heart of all initiation motifs in this archetype. Pruers do various things on this. They see all power is bad, or all capacity for violence is bad. And you get all sorts of tension between the puer and the senex around these issues. But one of the things about masculine initiation that you see in all these tribes is one of the aspects about becoming a man is becoming dangerous. If you're not dangerous, then you don't have any power. If you have power, you're dangerous. If you have power and you don't know you got it, you're even more dangerous. But if you have power and you don't know when you would use it and when you wouldn't use it, you're also dangerous. See? So the whole issue is, and this is true right across the front, and I would argue this is also true for the feminine initiation, but I don't pretend to speak on that stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's all about power and its stewardship. It's stewardship. The appropriate gaining of power and stewarding of power. See? And this is true in all these archetypes. It's true in power as political power, power as military power, power as insight power. We'll look at the magus, who gets power by knowledge, and sexual power, sexual potency. And it's all a matter, masculine maturation has to do with being empowered and knowing how to use it and when not to use it. Yeah.
In your introduction of the archetypes, you talked about the archetypes as being animal.
Yes.
That was for the purpose of defining them.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Not for the purpose of identifying with them or using the archetype.
Well, I think they're natural phenomena. That is to say, you come equipped with this, and the human being is faced with a challenge of using this morally, using the archetypes, accessing, using them morally. But the archetypes themselves, in my perception, do not give a damn whether you use them morally or not. The archetype of the warrior would just as soon be expressed in a Hitler as in a Gandhi. And I think it's very important to get clear about that. Because if you're not clear about that, then it makes you much more vulnerable to possession. And, if you kind of stay away from the archetypal powers, it makes you less dangerous in a way. But if you start getting powerful and creative, then the whole issue of ethics gets enormously focused. Because the more potent you are as a person, the more dangerous you are. And at the same time, the more potential you have for great good. And so the archetype itself, the king, can be Caligula, or it can be expressed like it's being expressed in some ways in the king of Thailand now, who I view as in many ways, a very good king. Nurturing his people, really serving his people in a very significant way. So I'm not putting the archetypes down, I'm just saying archetypes relate to human psyches. They want you. They want all of you. Each one wants all of you. They are very jealous. Archetypes are notoriously imperialistic and jealous of each other. And the more you study people, you will notice the archetypes fighting in their personalities. And the less strength their ego has, the less they are capable of mediating between these claims of these different archetypal structures. You see this in women who have a fight going on between the mother archetype and the Athena archetype. And they don't like each other. And you can even see in the women's experience recently, the Phyllis Schlafly's of this world and the Gloria Steinem's services to two different archetypal forms of the goddess. And so archetypes are jealous, they're imperialistic, they want everything. And one of the things to do in one's own psychological growth is to ask which archetypal structures have been getting more than their share of me. Because I figure if you ask that question, you can come up with a pretty insightful answer. Yeah, we still got a few minutes. Other comments or questions? Yes?
Do you comment on the impact of current video games where they stress the hero as opposed to the warrior?
I think that would be typical because they're appealing to the adolescent and the cougar and the young adult.
But they all involve one.
Yeah, right.
Figure.
Yes, right. Sure, right. Wonderful grandiosity. All they need is me, like that little movie, The Last Starfighter. The whole galaxy of galaxies is involved in this great war. And they have to come and get me because I know how to play the video game that is based on this particular starship. So I am drafted, so to speak, intergalactically drafted to win the war. And that's very powerful. You can really see the infantile grandiosity there. Other.
Would you like to comment on where these archetypes further themselves out in a healthy narrative?
Yeah, I think that I think it's very important. Let me just speak about the man. It's very important for a man to be very centered and secure in his masculinity in order to have a very successful marriage. That is, he needs to have a sense of order that's grounded in himself, in his deep center. And it's this king thing that gives a man that sense of deep security and centeredness, and that if his wife is angry with him, it will not totally unhinge the universe. So, and he will not have to get very retaliatory fast. Violent men, for example, are men who are not in touch with this in a positive way. They are very fragile and very vulnerable and easily put into a chaotic mode. And so it's very important for married life, and this would be, you can just extrapolate this for the feminine side. It's important for a man to know that he must not look to the woman for the meaning of his existence, for his core, for his center. Because if he's doing that, he's going to ruin the marriage. Because a woman knows that a man shouldn't be looking to her for the core of his existence. And she knows that if he is, there's something very wrong. Any more than she should be looking to him for the core of her deep feminine existence. Same thing would be true about the accessing the archetype of the warrior. You've got to be able to tell what your real enemies are. And you've got not to be possessed by this thing. A lot of marital fighting is when this thing just gets loose, acting out, unconscious. There's much too much. In fact, I think there are a lot of people that foster, a lot of counselors that foster enormously destructive manifestations of the warrior archetype in marriages. Nothing wrong with expressing related anger in a marriage, but encouraging people to just blow their tanks of every toxic waste that they ever had and dump it on their spouse, that is what I consider malpractice in marriage counseling. And I don't think couples ought to ever be encouraged to blow their tanks and dump it on each other. If they've got a lot of this infantile rage stored up in their toxic waste tanks, they need to be dumping this in the container of a very tight therapeutic relationship. They need to be dumping that on the analyst, not on the spouse. And if you're not related to this warrior thing in a healthy way, you'll be constantly gunning for the spouse, turning the spouse into the enemy. It's very common to turn the spouse into the enemy when the spouse is not the enemy, should not be seen as the enemy. And there are enemies. I'm a great believer that there are real enemies in this world. Otherwise, the world would be going down the tubes in so many ways if the human race didn't have real enemies. But that's just some of the ways. There are a lot of other ways, I'm sure. We'll talk more about that next week. Other comment? Yeah.
There was an article in Esquire magazine a while back that I read that talks about why men love war. Did you see that?
Somebody in one of my classes brought that.
I like the description of the inhumanicity of the warrior archetype.
Yeah. And the intimacy among men that you get. And
the guy was saying that people don't want to talk about Vietnam, not because it was so terrible, but because they enjoyed it so much. It was real odd. It was such a big experience that they sort of said, he said, we know that we'll never experience the intensity of ourselves.
Yes. Well, see, when you're mainlining the archetypal, you feel like a god. And the hardest thing to do with somebody who has tasted it is to wean them off of that. Because once you've had a little, it's like the tiger that ate a human. You know something. And what you know is what it's like to be, what I would say, it's not as fancy as to be an archetype, but it's to be divine. And there is something very, very divine about, you see it portrayed. That's why a lot of people hated that movie Apocalypse Now, but that guy that made that movie had a sense for this. Those choppers come in on that little village, strafing and napalming, and then they got Robert Duvall, an AirCal officer, who is just loving this and just such his teeth on edge. He's loving it so much. I love the smell of burning napalm, like burning flesh. That's too close to the truth. And that is, there is an excitement. You got to read Nietzsche to get it. Nietzsche understood this. And that's what drove him crazy. He had a taste of it. Übermensch, Superman. Well, Superman is simply a man that's gotten into the numinosity of the archetype. And once you taste it, you got very few options. You can totally shut down as a defense against it, which is what a lot of Vietnam War vets do. I'm a zombie. Well, I'm a zombie because if I'm not a zombie, I may kill your ass. And love it. See? So it's better for me to be a zombie and depressed. That is defending against the manic side of that. You can work on your spirituality, and this is where spirituality comes in, and it's very key, I mean, to just see what you're talking about here. If you want to traffic with the archetypal, you better work on a spirituality. Something that enables you to honor the archetypal without identifying with it. That's what spiritualities of all traditions are about. You've got to be able to honor it without identifying with it. If you don't honor it, then you think you are it. You show me somebody that's a militant atheist, and I'll show you a God. May not know it, but there's God walking around there. See?
We've missed something quite unintentionally in America. And I discovered this a couple of years ago when I went to London, and I went to St. Paul's Cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful big cathedral, stained glass, gold, and military heroes in statues around the periphery. The two were part of the same. They were treated together in this culture. And because of our separation of church and state, we separated those two, and we don't deal with them together in this culture.
Well, we do, but not very. We sort of play around with it. Arlington Cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery is a place where they're very much together. And in World War II, they tended to be very closely together. But the Vietnam War split it very heavily. One thing that's interesting to do is to do an archetypal analysis of the 60s. What happened to this archetype of the warrior in the 60s? Because it did split, you know, all over the place. It wasn't held together. But anyway, so you can work on the spirituality. I think it's very key. See, now Jungians talk about what? The ego archetypal self-axis. Well, we throw that around like that's, you know, well, what do you got to do? Well, you just got to develop an ego self-axis. Well, what does that mean? Well, let me tell you what it means, and we'll stop formally, and then we can chat. Those of you that have to run can get up and take off, but we'll be working with this same kind of thing next week. But here's what's involved in ego archetype axis. See, as long as you're depressed and out of touch with creativity, you don't need much in the way of careful discipline with regard to the archetypal realm, because you're not plugging it in, and you feel like an ordinary schmuck. And you project all this numinous stuff onto other people. That's the way most human beings throughout all history have handled it. It's a safer way for some people. It's not safe if you're a Jew or anybody else that somebody wants to sacrifice. But if you're just an ordinary person in Christian culture, then you project it on the Pope, and you project it on the blah, 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 and then they carry it for you, and you don't have to deal with it. Let the priest handle it. He's up there dealing with all that hot stuff. He's got to worry about the radiation, not me. I see, as long as you got that, you're kind of okay. But once you start getting the idea that you're in touch with the archetypal, then you got big problems. Because that stuff, here's what you got to get about the archetypal self. It is enormously tempting, and it is enormously powerful, and it has a siren's call. All that stuff about the siren's call, the archetypal realm goes, come on over here, come on to my house, you know. I'm going to give you something. I'm going to make you great, you know. And it's not passive. The archetypal, don't ever forget this. The archetypal is not passive. It's very assertive. It's out to get you. It wants you. The two key words of the archetypal self are more and better. It wants more from you and wants you to do it better. It wants you to do it better yesterday, perfectly, without effort. And if you listen to your critic, who's talking to you about why you didn't do it better yesterday and without effort, you know who you're listening to. It's the archetypal self talking to you, putting you down. But in any case, once you connect with it, it's very difficult not to get possessed by it. Take any cocaine addict. The dangerous thing about coke is it just plugs you right into the archetypal self. And you're wonderful when you're in that. And once you have been wonderful, it's not enough to just be ordinary. See? And that's why cocaine is so dangerous. And what it does to you is it puts you into your Mr. Wonderfulness. And you don't need any sleep. You don't need, any rest. You don't need anybody. You're God. And the archetypal self can live forever like that, but the human being can't. And that's what is so dangerous about it.
This is why I'm biased there. All the success of the athlete.
Sure. But this is so, and all compulsions, every compulsion has behind it an archetypal self-structure that is pressing. And I don't care what kind of compulsion it is. You got compulsive behavior, it's the archetypal self pressing. And if it's really up close to you where you can see it, it lights you up like a Christmas tree. And then you don't like disidentifying with it. Even if it's running you down, you don't like disidentifying with it. Because it's one thing to criticize yourself from the point of view of a God. It's closer to being God than just accepting one's humanness. And so staying human is this enormously difficult task when you're relating to this archetypal self. And nobody tells us about this very much. But why spirituality? Well, that is another way to talk about working on the ego self axis, working on an optimal relationship to the self, to the archetypes, so that they do for you what they're designed, I think, to do, which is to provide you with energy and vision, sense of meaning. If you're really relating to these archetypes of the masculine, you will have energy and you will not be bored. You will have a sense of meaning. Then that's the good news. Bad news is if they have you, you will act that stuff out in ways that are destructive probably for you and others. Many great artists acted out in ways destructive for themselves and others. Now we've got to stop there. I'll stick around and chat a few minutes, but next week we'll look at the archetype of the magician and the archetype of the lover for more detail.
Discover your true masculine power through the king, warrior, magician, and lover archetypes, energies that have defined strong men for millennia. In just 5 minutes, this free test reveals which of your masculine energies are in balance and which need work. The result? Clear direction for your personal development and masculine empowerment. Thousands of men have gained insights to reshape their lives. Why not you? Take the Masculine Energy Indicator test now at masculinetest.com.